I am pleased to introduce and have Chris Cameron with us for the first time here in Atlanta. He's presented in the Charlotte area with our being affiliate there. He's a member. He's also an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. He'll be discussing his book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. And he's written other books that I'm sure he will probably discuss here today. So please give a warm welcome to Chris Cameron.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the insights and things I found in the course of researching and writing this book. I'll start talking about sort of how I got interested in the project in the first place. So as Mandisa mentioned, I am a professor, so I was sort of finishing up work on my first book, which is a history of Black abolitionists in Massachusetts. And I was actually working on the bibliography. I had to find some random citation or something. So I ended up rereading Al Raboteau's book, Slave Religion. It's a classic work looking at the sort of syncretism of African traditions and evangelical Protestantism in the 18th and 19th centuries. And most of the book is looking at theistic religion, right? But towards the very end, he has a couple of pages, like 2 pages, where he starts off, of course, not all slaves believed in everything I've been discussing the past 300 pages, right? Some could not reconcile the notion of a just and benevolent God with their lives in slavery. He only gives a few examples, but it really sort of piqued my interest, you know, because I'd never really read anything about free thought among slaves, right? I'd heard about other Black free thinkers throughout the 20th century, but not in that earlier period. And so this was sort of in late 2012 or so, and it came right at a time where sort of personally I was looking for kind of community and stuff like that with other free thinkers and other secularists. You know, I was connecting with folks on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. I don't think we had a BN chapter in Charlotte then. That would come maybe a year or two later. But as I started connecting with folks on social media, I began running across like blog posts and things like that on individual Black freethinkers, right? Something on Hubert Harrison or something on Nella Larsen. And so, you know, taking that, I sort of started looking for kind of more developed scholarship than just your kind of short blog posts to see, well, what have historians of Black religion or African American culture and intellectual history, what have they been writing about this? And it turns out not very much, right? Theologians have written some. Anthony Pinn, for example, has written a bunch. William R. Jones, and one literary scholar, Michael Lackey, has a book on African American atheists. But no historians had treated this, right? And I thought, you know, that's kind of strange because I'm coming across a lot of different like individuals, and some of these are really important intellectuals and political activists within African American life, right? So why isn't anybody sort of trying to tie this together? So for me, this project was sort of a really great blend of the kind of personal, right, to kind of really get me invested, but also something that could make an important scholarly contribution, right? And as I sort of got into the work, I started to think about, you know, well, why has this history sort of been ignored by other historians and by other scholars? And one of the main things I kept coming across was this notion of African Americans as naturally religious, right? That this sort of permeates the scholarship, it permeates Black popular culture, white popular culture, right? It's just all throughout American society, this idea that we are naturally and overly religious. And I actually found that this idea started in 1835 with the work of the Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing. In 1835, he published a book entitled Slavery, and he was an abolitionist. He was a supporter of Black schools and things like that. So he was progressive for his time, right? But nevertheless, he helped sort of kind of start to cement this notion of blacks as naturally religious. So in slavery, he noted of Southern slaves, of all the races of men, the African is the mildest and most susceptible of attachment. He loves where the European would hate. He watches the life of a master whom the North American Indian in like circumstances would stab to the heart. The African is affectionate. And the primary reason that Channing gave for this supposedly loving and affectionate nature of African-descended peoples was that, he said, the colored race are said to be peculiarly susceptible to the religious sentiment, right? So the scholar Curtis Evans notes in his book, The Burden of Black Religion, that after Channing published that book, both abolitionists and pro-slavery thinkers alike really sort of appropriated his argument and started kind of reinforcing this idea of the natural religiosity of blacks. We see this in free thought circles during the 19th century, right? So in 1883, Eugene MacDonald, the editor of The Truth Seeker, leading free thought publication of the 19th century, noted in very similar language to Channing almost 50 years earlier, "There's no class of people in the world more religious than the Negroes. Their fervent African temperament makes them peculiarly susceptible to religious sentiment." I think he plagiarized Channing or something, because it's like the same language, right? And these notions persisted into the 20th century, right? I found another example in the 1950s where Langston Hughes, one of the people that appears as a freethinker in this story, he's testifying before Joseph McCarthy's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and he's been called in to testify about the atheist and communist themes in his 1932 poem, Goodbye Christ. So at one point during the testimony, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, he wanted to know whether Hughes thought the book is dead, right, referring to the Bible, and whether or not Goodbye Christ could be considered a reflection or a good reflection of African American religious values. Dirksen, this white senator, noted he was very familiar with African Americans, and he knew them to be innately a very devout and religious people, right? Just a couple of examples, but these types of statements come up over and over again, whether we're talking about politicians, actors, religious figures, anybody, are advancing this idea of the sort of natural religiosity of blacks. So that's one of the main reasons this has been ignored from sort of a scholarly standpoint. Another reason is kind of the politics of respectability that's held sway among African American historians themselves, right? So starting with William Cooper Nell's The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which he published in 1854. Black history has been a project aimed at achieving racial equality, right? And so a lot of black historians doing black history have been very hesitant to work on topics and to publish conclusions that would portray the race in a negative light, right? And working on a history of black atheism is probably, from the perspective of a lot of people, as negative as it gets, right? So it seemingly goes against, traditional American values and all that, although I would argue that atheism fulfills American values like independence and liberty, right, and critical thought and all of that. So this politics of respectability that's held sway among black historians has, I think, made many sort of loath to explore topics like this and to ask questions that would make them kind of connect some of those individual stories into kind of a broader history. So I think now I'll just sort of take you through a couple of the chapters of the book, sort of give brief synopses of the 4 chapters of the book, which look at slavery and Reconstruction for Chapter 1, the Harlem Renaissance for Chapter 2, socialism and communism for Chapter 3, and then it ends with the civil rights and black power. So African American free thought arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, really right around the time as the free thought movement among whites, right? The rise of deism among figures like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and those guys. But unlike the Enlightenment origins of free thought among white intellectuals, black free thought grew out of the institution of slavery and the conditions that blacks endured within it. The increased evangelism to slaves that characterized the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century also brought to the fore what many saw to be the hypocritical nature of their Christian masters, including the practice of holding slaves itself, but also the way that their masters treated them. So one of the key reasons that African Americans in the 19th century embraced free thought was this inability to resolve the problem of evil, or how to reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the presence of a benevolent and omnipotent deity. And of course, for slaves, the problem of evil is intimately related to their daily lives, as a central component of slavery is suffering, whether we're talking about physical suffering and brutal physical punishments, or the emotional suffering of having your children sold away from you, or your wife sold away from you down south. So many slaves did find meaning in religion, right? Whether monotheistic ones such as Christianity, African-derived traditions such as conjure. Others, however, rejected religion altogether, right? Many did not believe that a life under slavery was valuable. They could not believe that this was simply testing them for an afterlife. And they needed an answer to the problem of suffering before they could accept the idea of a god or gods. And when this answer didn't come, they turned to atheism as the only logical solution to the problem of evil. Now, for probably four or five decades now, historians have used slave narratives to document these multiple aspects of the black religious experience, right? Much of what we know about what Rabbitoh explores, for example, right, the syncretism of African and Christian traditions, or the presence of Islam, a lot of what we know comes from these slave narratives. But these narratives also speak to the presence of atheism within 19th century slave communities. And many of the ones that I'm using in this book are the same ones that folks are using to look at the rise of Protestantism among blacks in the 19th century, but they haven't been kind of asking the questions, right? So a lot of times it's just sort of a change in perspective and asking different questions that can lead us to some new conclusions. So one enslaved person that I discuss in the book is a man named Austin Stewart, right, who wrote an autobiography or slave narrative in the mid-1850s. He had been enslaved in Virginia up until about the age of 30 years old. And in one instance in his narrative, he's discussing a brutal whipping that his sister endured on a Sabbath morning. And he makes a point of noting that this occurred on a Sabbath morning. He says this like 3 different times. And he asks in his narrative, after discussing this whipping, "Can anyone wonder that I and other slaves often doubted the sincerity of every white man's religion? Can it be a matter of astonishment that slaves often feel there is no just God for the poor African?" Right? Charles Ball, another enslaved man, likewise reflects on the irreligiosity present in slave communities in his autobiography. He notes, "There is in general very little sense of religious obligation or duty amongst the slaves on the cotton plantations, and Christianity cannot be with propriety called the religion of these people. They have not the slightest regard for the Sabbath day, and their masters make no efforts to impress them with the least respect for this sacred institution." So in this passage, Ball addresses one of the key components of free thought among slaves, namely a disregard for the Sabbath that was fostered in part by masters' opposition to converting their slaves. According to another enslaved man named Henry Bibb, the Sabbath is not regarded by a large number of slaves as a day of rest. They have no schools to go to, no moral or religious instruction at all in many localities. Hence they resort to some kind of amusement. Those who make no profession of religion resort to the woods in large numbers on that day to gamble, fight, get drunk, and break the Sabbath. And he says that, this was important to me, right? Because he says, those who make no profession of religion, right? Kind of confirming the fact that these people exist, right? And masters tolerate this behavior, he says, and they actually encourage it. They don't just tolerate it. They give slaves the whiskey and let them fight it out, right? Encouraging them to wrestle with one another. So you have the opposition of masters to converting their slaves. That's one of the foundations of free thought. Pro-slavery religion was another key development that fostered the growth of African-American atheism. And pro-slavery religion really began to take off in the United States after the 1820s. So the 1820s is when you start to have sort of an enhanced abolitionist movement, right, with the creation of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, which opened up its pages to the writings of black abolitionists and some black freethinkers, new anti-slavery societies. So this in turn leads to more opposition to them, right? You see the rising and more vocal pro-slavery movement. And Southern ministers, Southern theological schools, all sort of kind of joined in this chorus of people who felt they had to defend slavery much more strongly after the 1820s. William Wells Brown discusses this development in his slave narrative. He says that that he never could take his master's prayer sessions very seriously because of slavery's evangelical bloodhounds and its religious slaveholders. Henry Bibb says of white preachers in his autobiography that the slaves, with but few exceptions, have no confidence at all in their preaching because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine. They say, servants, be obedient to your masters, and he that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. So most slaves, Bibb notes, feel they're destined to die in bondage unless they're delivered by some deity. And when that doesn't happen, he says they cannot believe or trust in such a religion as above named. Now, aside from the freethinker Frederick Douglass, what we usually see during the era of slavery is atheism, and religious skepticism, but not necessarily humanism, right? Not necessarily that taking it to the next step and really trying to do something to improve your world. But that's, of course, because of their situation as enslaved people. Now, when some of these individuals were lucky enough to gain their freedom, like Frederick Douglass or William Wells Brown or others, then you do see sort of the development of a humanist perspective. You do see many of these people very active in both the abolitionist movements and, in Douglass's case, the women's rights movement. Where you do see humanism start to develop more is in the early 20th century. And this is among folks in both the New Negro Renaissance and in sort of radical politics, which I'll get to in just a bit. So Chapter 2 focuses on the New Negro Renaissance of the 1920s and the 1930s. And this is in large part an outgrowth of the Great Migration to the northern cities that started right around World War I. So from 1914 till about 1930, you'd see roughly 1.5 million black Southerners move from both the rural and urban South to cities like Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. And around the same time, or kind of towards the end of World War I, there was also something called the Red Summer of 1919, whereby it was basically a backlash to sort of radical organizing. It was a backlash to groups like the NAACP as well as the Socialist Party, stuff like that. And one of the things that you see is a lot of black soldiers who had fought in World War I coming back home thinking that, all right, I've made, helped make the world safe for democracy. Hopefully I've made an argument for citizenship and for equality back home. Not only did that not happen, but things were actually worse for a lot of them, right? Many of these soldiers coming home were in their uniform and they'd be targeted, for lynching and just physical violence and stuff like this. So you see this huge backlash, hundreds of lynchings and deaths from race riots during that Red Summer of 1919. And one of the things that this did for a select group of African Americans is it actually made them sort of hold back on more kind of overt radical political organizing and turn to less overt means of making the case for racial equality. And that those less overt means included artistic production. Right? If we can show that we're capable of producing great art, great literature, stuff like that, then we can sort of make a kind of indirect argument for racial equality and help to combat Jim Crow that way. So the Great Migration and that sort of backlash that we see with the Red Summer provided the foundation for the New Negro or the Harlem Renaissance beginning around 1920. And one of the reasons that the Harlem Renaissance becomes such a key moment for the rise and the growth of Black free thought is because for the first time now you have African Americans who are skeptical of religion, who are around other people who think the same things, right? Or who don't think the same things, who don't believe in some of the same things. So, Langston Hughes growing up in Joplin, Missouri, didn't encounter many free thinkers there, right? Zora Neale Hurston growing up in Eatonville, Florida, where her father was the preacher at the Baptist church, could not be open about her doubts, right, and her skepticism. And she mentions in her autobiography that she published in the 1940s that she was having those doubts when she was, 8, 9 years old, but never felt free to sort of voice those doubts in Eatonville. But when these folks get to Harlem, right, and they're around other people who kind of share some of the same critical perspectives on religion, share some of the same doubts, now they can kind of finally start to build community with sort of like-minded people. So whereas, most Harlemites would have been going to church on Sunday morning, folks like Hughes and Hurston and W.E.B. Du Bois and others were gathering in A. Philip Randolph's parlor on Sunday mornings and talking about, radical politics or literature or religion, right? So this becomes a really important moment in kind of building secular community. And we see free thought perspectives in a lot of the literature produced by some of the leading writers of the Harlem Renaissance, with one of these being Nella Larsen and her novel Quicksand. Now, Larsen was born in the late 19th century, spent most of her youth in Chicago before leaving in 1907 to attend Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. After graduating from Fisk, she moved to New York, became a nurse. She married a Black physicist and would eventually start to get into writing. She was a librarian at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which is now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So as a librarian there, she was able to sort of build networks and build community with a lot of the other kind of literary minded folks in Harlem at the time. So she published a few shorter pieces throughout the 1920s and then would publish her novel Quicksand in 1928. And the central character in Quicksand is a woman named Helga Crane, a 22-year-old woman, and the story begins with her articulating her dissatisfaction with Naxos, which is an anagram of the word Saxon, right, and is a fictional school that's a composite of Fisk and Tuskegee universities, where she had also worked. Now, from the novel's onset, Helga Crane feels out of place, and it's primarily because of religion. And this is from like page 1 or 2 of the novel, right? She's in her room hoping to get a few minutes to rest and change clothes and instead she has to go, her and hundreds of students and teachers are, she says, herded into the sun-baked chapel to listen to the banal, patronizing, and even the insulting remarks of one of the renowned white preachers of the state. So the preacher discusses at length how Naxos Negroes were better than other blacks because they knew how to stay in their place. He also said he greatly admired blacks for their progress, but urged them to know when and where to stop pushing for more. And then he had spoken of contentment, she writes, embellishing his words with scriptural quotations and pointing out to them that it was their duty to be satisfied in the estate to which they had been called, hewers of wood and drawers of water. And then he had prayed. So from the first couple pages of the book, Larsen portrays Christianity as a stifling religion, one that whites skillfully employ to stymie racial progress, and one that African Americans themselves also use to inhibit the expression of black culture. A little while later, she's talking about the school's dean of women, a character that was likely representative of Margaret Murray Washington, wife of Booker T. Washington, who she had basically had to work with at Tuskegee University and who she didn't like particularly much. And so in the novel, this Dean of Women tells Helga that black women should never wear bright colors, right, like green, red, or yellow, but should instead wear brown, navy blue, and black. Helga couldn't understand this, thinking that bright colors were exactly what darker women should be wearing. These people yapped loudly of race, race consciousness, of race pride, she pronounced, and yet suppressed its delightful manifestations, love of color, joy of rhythmic motion, naive, spontaneous laughter. So again, for Helga, the respectability that went hand in hand with black Christianity was not helping African Americans, but rather stifling their individuality and repressing their beautiful black culture. Now, Helga's Larsen's work is particularly important because it contained probably the most extensive discussion and exploration of religious skepticism in African American literature before 1930. Now, this fact alone doesn't necessarily make Larsen a freethinker, but I was able to find contemporary evidence that points to her own lack of belief. So there's a short biography of Larsen published in the New York Amsterdam News that notes a contemporary biography that notes she was a modern woman, for she smokes, does not believe in religion, churches, and the like. And in Yale University's archive, I also found a letter that she wrote to her literary patron, Carl Van Vechten, where she noted that she was no fan of the black church and that the Imes family that she married into was, quote, tiresome and ultra-religious. And contemporary reviewers of Quicksand also kind of noted the affinities between Crane and Larsen. So it seemed to have been well known at the time that Nella Larsen was a freethinker herself. And this book, Quicksand, is a key text in the history of black free thought because it intimately ties gender inequality and sexual oppression to religion. So in the text, heterosexual marriage is not celebrated, but rather decried as a symbol of oppression, and it serves as a focal point of biting critiques of the black church. So after Crane was at Naxos, she ended up moving to New York for a while, part of the Great Migration, right? And eventually went off to Europe, came back, and she married a revival preacher named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. In a very, she had a sort of dramatic conversion experience after she'd been dumped by some guy. She ends up marrying this preacher. So she moves down to rural Alabama. She has 4 kids in 3 years, a set of twins. And after the 4th kid, she's, basically basically almost on her deathbed, and she realizes, I have screwed up my life, right? So by doing the sort of normal, the kind of heteronormative things that black women are supposed to do, I've absolutely ruined my life. And the reason I did that was because of Christianity, right? So she sort of recognizes this and kind of makes a call for black people to let go of Christianity, right? Another key freethinker of the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston. Now, I had mentioned Zora Neale Hurston grew up in Eatonville, Florida. She started to doubt Christianity at a very young age. Eventually, also as part of the Great Migration, she would move first to D.C., where she attended Howard very briefly, but then would move on to New York City and attend Barnard College, and would also take classes at Columbia University with working with Franz Boas, the anthropologist, who was also a freethinker himself. Now, Hurston, she notes in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, this sort of feeling of rejection, or fear of rejection by our community. You know, something that a lot of us could probably relate to, right? Who maybe have very religious families. And she felt guilty about her skepticism. She notes, when I was asked if I loved God, I always said yes, because I knew that was the thing I was supposed to say. It was a guilty secret with me for a long time, right? But she says, you know, as early as I can remember, I was always questing and seeking after the truth, right? People would tell her certain things about God, and it never made sense to her, right? So her path towards free thought began in Eatonville, but would sort of continue to develop after she moved to New York City, after she started attending college, right? When she read history, she learned that Christianity was not always spread through revivals like it was back home, but rather through the sword. And in short order, she would embrace Ludwig Feuerbach's claim in his 1841 book, The Essence of Christianity, that our ideas of God are merely reflections of our own hopes and desires. She writes, people need religion because the great masses fear life and its consequences. Its responsibilities weigh heavy. Feeling a weakness in the face of great forces, men seek an alliance with an omnipotence to bolster up their feelings of weakness, even though the omnipotence they rely upon is a creature of their own minds. It gives them a feeling of security. I don't have any confirmation of this, but I strongly suspect that while she was at Columbia, she was reading people like Feuerbach. I think she must have also read some Nietzsche too, because she has a number of passages in her autobiography where she's basically saying, only weak people need religion, strong people don't. And that's kind of the central idea in a lot of Nietzsche's works, right? So she's another key figure, but this chapter on the Harlem Renaissance talks about a lot of folks that we might have read in junior high school or high school. Langston Hughes, Elaine Locke, Claude McKay, a lot of these folks, but we learn about them from a literary standpoint, some of them from even a political standpoint with some of the organizing work that they did, but we don't never necessarily learn like what was at the foundation of their literary productions, what was influencing their political perspectives, and for a lot of them it was their religious skepticism. You see it cropping up in their novels, in their poetry from folks like Hughes, because you can be more creative and take some more liberties in these types of formats. But you also see it in nonfiction sources, right? Langston Hughes discusses his sort of fake conversion story in his 1940 autobiography, Along This Way. The Big C. I'm confusing him with McKay. So the big C, and Hurston discusses her sort of growing path towards free thought in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. But curiously enough, the publisher removed all of the critical references to religion from the original edition of her autobiography. Those were discovered later by another freethinker, Alice Walker, and would be put back in after the 1970s. So from 1943 up through the late 1970s, you could read Hurston's autobiography and never really know her real views on religion. So big props to Alice Walker for sort of bringing much of her work back to light, and especially the sort of skepticism about religion. So the next chapter looks at the same time period, 19 teens through the 1930s, but changes perspective from looking at literature to focusing more on radical politics. So while some African Americans did sort of back away from overt politics due to white backlash, others embraced it, and really during roughly the same time as the Harlem Renaissance. And you see many African Americans starting to join ranks with the socialists and with the Communist Party. There are a couple of reasons for this sort of growing appeal of socialism and communism to blacks. One, both parties were sort of internationalists in their perspective, right? Wanted, workers of the world to unite. And so that sort of internationalism actually went well with a developing Pan-Africanism among black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and others, right? So that was really important. And also, the Communist Party was really sort of front and center in trying to sort of address Jim Crow and trying to sort of help combat racism in the United States. So when 9 young African-American men were falsely accused of rape, the Scottsboro Boys in the early 1930s, the NAACP was a little hesitant to get involved, but the Communist Party was right there front and center, sort of helping to fund their defense. NAACP eventually came around. They're like, we can't have these communists outshining us. But the communists were there first, right? And the communists were like helping to organize speaking tours for the mothers of the Scottsboro Boys. So, a lot of black political activists were seeing this, and they were thinking, that's the party that I want to join, right? The Republicans, the Democrats, they're not doing any of that. So one of the leading socialist, Marxist thinkers who was also a free thinker was Hubert Harrison. Hubert Harrison migrated to Harlem, not necessarily as part of the Great Migration from the South, but in the late 19th and the early 20th century, you sort of see increasing numbers of African-descended people from the Caribbean migrating to New York City and other American cities in the North. So Harrison was part of this. He was born in St. Croix in 1883. He emigrated to Harlem in 1900, and by the following year, he had left Orthodox and institutional Christianity for good. Although the process had sort of been something of a gradual one, he notes, that came after reading the works of some of the earliest freethinkers like Thomas Paine, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and others. Now, as is typical among black freethinkers, Harrison's rejection of religion was not necessarily an easy one, right? He notes of his conversion that I was not one of those who did not care. I suffered. Oh, how my poor wounded soul cried out in agony. This really speaks to the sort of overwhelming grip that the black church has on the psyches of black folks and sometimes on their very physical bodies, right? But after putting aside the authority of the Bible and belief in God, Harrison wrote, I now had a new belief, agnosticism. I said belief. What I did mean was philosophy of life, point of observation, attitude towards things. So, free thinkers are always accused of not believing in anything, right? And we see from, the earliest history of black free thought, once we start to get black folks writing about and articulating their secular perspectives, that they're noting this is a belief just in something else, right? So agnosticism for him is not simply lack of belief in God, but it's a philosophical bent of mind that stressed reason, curiosity, and humility. So Harrison saw himself as an intellectual descendant of Thomas Paine, somebody who could use similar methods as Paine to help bring free thought to greater numbers of African Americans. He wrote, "It should seem that Negroes of all Americans would be found in the free thought fold, since they have suffered more than any other class of Americans from the dubious blessings of Christianity." These dubious blessings included biblical justifications for slavery, especially the curse of Canaan, as well as churches' support for the institution. And even in the 1900s, according to Harrison, the church among the Negroes today exerts a more powerful influence than anything else in the sphere of ideas. Nietzsche's contention that the ethics of Christianity are the slave's ethics seem to be justified. So throughout his time in New York City, Harrison would come to be known as really the foremost black intellectual and especially public intellectual in New York City and in Harlem, right? He is sort of most famous for being a stepladder orator, right? So, you have folks like Robert Ingersoll who give more kind of formal talks in convention centers and universities and all that. Harrison just traveled around New York City, got up on a ladder, and just started talking to anybody that would listen. And a lot of people did listen to him, right? He wasn't, you go to New York City today, and in certain areas you have these like kooks who are just out there preaching, right? Nobody's listening to them. Everybody's just walking by. Well, when Harrison was talking, you stopped to listen, right? And he had great crowds, and he influenced a lot of other black free thinkers. But he's an example of this sort of intersection, right, of socialism and free thought, right? Both the socialist and communist parties specifically sort of articulated an identity for themselves as non-religious parties, right? In 1924, the Comintern, the Communist International, put out a directive saying very clearly, we expect all communists to be atheists, right? So this is sort of the default religious position for communists. So that's another thing, of course, that's appealing to these black freethinkers, right? Along with the sort of internationalism, along with the efforts to combat Jim Crow, is just that the default sort of position of these parties was that our members are not religious, right? Sometimes they could take that, a little far, right? So I've done some research on the Harlem Unitarian Church, which was started by Egbert Ethelred Brown in 1920. He was a theist, but very sort of liberal and progressive in his theology, right? And didn't, truck any belief in a God that, in a religion that didn't come with social activism and political activism. But he ran his church as sort of a forum model, and he would have debates on various topics, and he would invite black atheists to come in and debate with theists about whether or not there's a God. One person who came and did this a lot was Richard B. Moore, who is a communist and atheist. He was one of the founders of the African Blood Brotherhood. And he was actually disciplined by the Communist Party for taking part in these debates in the Harlem Unitarian Church because, according to them, communists aren't supposed to be involved in any religion, no matter how liberal or how progressive it was. So sometimes they did take it a little too far, right? Richard Wright was another leading communist and atheist figure, right? He published his autobiography, Black Boy, in 1945. And it's so surprising to me going through the scholarship on Richard Wright that nobody else is really making a big deal about the fact that his sort of move towards atheism is the central theme of part 1 of that autobiography, about half of a fairly lengthy autobiography. I mean, part 1 is all about his move away from Christianity, right? And in all of the sort of literary criticism and histories that include Wright, you really don't see any discussion of the sort of centrality of this theme in his work. But he was another of these leading figures. Additionally, you see folks like Louise Thompson Patterson, Grace Campbell, Elizabeth Hendrickson, who was very similar to Hubert Harrison in being one of the most renowned sort of stepladder orators of the time. So we see kind of the intersections of feminism with these three figures, communism and free thought during the 1920s and 1930s. And the last figure I'll talk about for this chapter is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois grew up in Massachusetts. He had attended the Congregational Church there. He started moving away from religion after he went to Fisk University in the 1880s, right? And it was just little stuff that sort of turned him off, kind of similar to Nella Larsen, right? This politics of respectability. So just the authorities expecting all the students at Fisk to go to church every day, right? Or not being able to organize a dance because I was anti-Christian. Little stuff like this started kind of turning him away from religion. And then in his autobiography that he published in 1968, he notes that his path towards free thought basically was kind of culminated in a study abroad experience in Germany, where he became politically active with socialists there. He became a free thinker there, and then he came back and would immediately start alienating other black folk with his sort of religious skepticism. He got his first job teaching at a black college and immediately started pissing people off because he wouldn't lead black students in prayer, right? Something that all professors there were expected to do at Wilberforce University in Ohio, right? Which was a university affiliated with the AME Church. So he didn't last too long at Wilberforce, would eventually move down here to Atlanta for about 10 years, and then would move up to New York City and become one of the founders of the NAACP and the editor of the Crisis magazine. And over the years, he would open up the Crisis to writings and articles by black freethinkers, by white freethinkers like Franz Boas. He would also publish articles himself that were highly critical of Christianity. And Du Bois is a figure that, because of his long lifespan and because of his, great intellectual scholarly production, but also political activism, really spans the last 3 chapters of the book, right? So a lot of the earliest writers of the Harlem Renaissance cut their teeth by publishing works in the Crisis while he was the editor. He was also active with the Socialist Party, would become a communist later on in life, and would live, up to right around the time of the March on Washington in 1963. So it really sort of spans the Renaissance, socialism and communism, and the civil rights movement, which I'll turn to now. So what I was really trying to do with this last chapter on the civil rights movement is to give us a different perspective on a movement that most scholars are portraying as a religious one. Because of the prominence of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy and others, we've come to see this as a wholly religious movement led only by the black church, right? And that's simply not the case. Barbara Savage published a book called Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, I think in 2011, where she notes that less than 10% of black churches participated in any overt civil rights organizing. And she worked on this book, she researched this book for like 15 years, right? And she says that it's actually a miracle that we've come to see the civil rights movement as a religious one, right? because that's just simply not the case. That doesn't mean that there weren't prominent religious people involved and that churches were not important, but it was not wholly a religious movement. Just as in earlier periods, black freethinkers were central players in civil rights during the 1960s. And we can see this especially in the Black Power movement. So Black Power emerged out of the civil rights activity of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966. So SNCC had been created in 1960. It was initially led by Christian activists such as John Lewis, who was committed to the philosophy of nonviolence. This philosophy and approach of SNCC soon began to change, however, especially after James Forman took over the organization. Now, Forman grew up in rural Mississippi. He had started moving away from religion as a young man. In a scene repeated in many autobiographies, including Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Zora Neale Hurston, Forman writes in The Making of Black Revolutionaries that at the age of 12, he was attending a revival service, and some of his friends yelled out that they had got religion. The older people shouted that they had got religion too, he writes. At the age of 12, in a Baptist tradition and setting, I did not have the courage to tell my grandmother that I thought this was all nonsense. I simply observed what had been happening around me and knew that I too could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So I covered my face with my handkerchief and cried, "Lord, have mercy." It worked. I was taken off the mourner's bench, and the people talked of how many children got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. You see this scene over and over again, right? Which really makes me doubt the statistics about the religiosity of African Americans. When 95% believe in God, no. Many of those people are saying that they believe in God just because they think that's what you're supposed to do, right? So Forman would sort of kind of formally become an atheist after studying philosophy at Wilson Junior College in Chicago, and he would bring his secular perspective to his civil rights activity. He became the executive secretary of SNCC in 1963, and he grounded his activism in secular humanism, as he believed that Christianity was a prime reason that blacks were in a subordinate position in the United States. In 1966, Forman, along with Stokely Carmichael, led the transition of SNCC from a religious to a secular organization, and they helped to inaugurate the Black Power movement. And the main goals of Black Power as an ideology were promoting black economic advancement, pride in black culture, independent black political action, and armed self-reliance, or rejection of nonviolence. Forman was the earliest proponent of Black Power. The man who would probably become most associated with the movement was Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael was an immigrant from Trinidad who had grown up in the Bronx, where he attended the prestigious Bronx High School of Science. His best friend there was a Jewish kid named Gene Dennis, whose father worked for the Communist Party. And at Bronx Science, Carmichael began attending meetings of the Young Communist League, and he would quickly embrace atheism. In the 1960s, communists were still atheists. So this is a perspective that he would bring to his civil rights work in the 1960s and in ensuing decades. Now, the Black Power is, in ideology, so the main institutional expression of the ideology of Black Power would be the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So the Black Panther Party was a secular organization created to advance many of these goals of Black Power, right? Economic autonomy, electing black political candidates, and promoting self-defense of black people in the face of racist violence that they encounter throughout the nation. So many prominent leaders, including Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, David Hilliard, and Eldridge Cleaver, were outspoken in their atheism. Like earlier thinkers, they saw the church as conservative, and they advanced a humanist politics that rejected the authority of what they termed Uncle Tom bootlicking preachers, to use David Hilliard's words in a speech that he gave at the National Council of Black Churchmen in 1970. 1969, said this to a group of black preachers. So the Black Panther Party is the sort of political expression of black power. It advances black humanism through its 10-point platform, through its political goals, also through its newspaper, the Black Panther, which gave space to the writings of secular thinkers like Sarah Webster Fabio and Yvette Pearson and others, right? So the Black Panther became something of a free thought publication along with its articles on political topics. Now, this is the political expression of black power. The literary and intellectual expression is known as the Black Arts Movement, which lasted roughly a decade from the mid-1960s through the mid-1970s. Writers of the Black Arts Movement had multiple goals: promoting and articulating black pride, black nationalism, rejecting respectability politics, and this latter goal went hand in hand with a rejection of Christianity. So one of the key figures of this movement was James Baldwin. Baldwin rejected religion because he viewed it as otherworldly and unsuited to addressing the problems of black people in America. In his autobiographical work, The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, Baldwin notes he had become a teenage preacher in Harlem during the early 1930s. And even after being a preacher for 3 years, he writes, "The blood of the Lamb had not cleansed me in any way whatever. I was just as black as I had been the day that I was born. Therefore, when I faced a congregation, it began to take all the strength I had, not to stammer, not to curse, not to tell them to throw away their Bibles and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike." So Baldwin, of course, is one of the most popular and widely read black authors of the 1960s, and multiple works, including The Fire Next Time, Blues for Mr. Charlie, Go Tell It on the Mountain, demonstrate the influence of his rejection of Christianity. Now, along with Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry was another key figure of the Black Arts Movement and another writer whose secularism heavily influenced her literature. So she was born in Chicago in 1930, moved to Harlem in the mid-1950s, where she worked with W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson on the anti-imperial, anti-capitalist magazine Freedom. She's most well known for her play A Raisin in the Sun, set in the South Side of Chicago sometime between the end of World War II and 1959. And this play focuses on the Younger family shortly after the death of the patriarch Walter Younger Sr. The family is waiting on $10,000 in life insurance money, and much of the drama revolves around what is going to be done with the funds. Walter Younger Jr. Would like Mama to give him the money to invest in some dubious business ventures, while Mama wants to use the money to buy a house in a white neighborhood and support the medical career of her daughter, Benitha. Benitha is a modern woman who embraces feminism, anti-colonialism, and atheism. Many people urge her to marry her middle-class suitor, George Murchison, but she decides to wait until after her schooling is complete, putting her career ahead of middle-class domesticity. And when Mama remarks to her that she will be a doctor if God wills it, Benitha replies, "God hasn't got a thing to do with it." She goes on to express her frustration that God gets all the credit for human achievements, asking Mama whether or not God would be paying her tuition. Of course, Mama's incredulous at the statement, noting, I took you and Walter to church every Sunday. I don't know how I didn't bring you up to speak like this. And Benitha says, "Mama, you don't understand. It's all a matter of ideas, and God is just one idea I don't accept. It's not important. I'm not going out and being immoral or committing crimes because I don't believe in God. It's just that I get tired of him getting credit for all the things the human race achieves through its own effort. There simply is no blasted God." Now, again, for many writers, you have to sort of ask the question, does the views of the characters in their novels or whatever, does that really express their own views? So I wasn't comfortable just saying that that Hansberry was a freethinker because of Beneatha. I had to do a little bit more digging, but then I found an interview that she did with Mike Wallace shortly after the play came out, where she says very clearly, Beneatha is me 8 years ago, right? And she says in her autobiography as well, we don't need mysticism to exalt man. Man exalts himself by his own achievements. So her perspective on religion is very similar to Zora Neale Hurston, namely that we attribute to God aspects of nature and human life that we don't understand. So to wrap this all up, despite views of blacks as naturally religious, free thought has been a vital and significant component of black culture and politics since the 19th century. This history is not a particularly obscure one. Yes, I had to do some digging in archives, but a lot of the evidence I found of black free thought comes from readily available autobiographies, novels, slave narratives that you can get on the very well-known online platform documenting the American South out of UNC. So it just takes some looking for it, right? I think it's vital to understand and to teach this history to show that, to show black skeptics today that we're part of a very long and vibrant tradition of black free thinkers, a tradition that includes some of the most prominent intellectuals and political activists in African American life. Thank you.